Welcome to Pirate Living Podcast. We are your hosts, Karan and Kristen. On this podcast, we are highlighting ordinary people living extraordinary lives. These are pirates who take small, bold actions daily to create social change. Pirate life is all about rebelling and breaking the rules for good. Creating lasting social change starts by first breaking our inner rules. After all, the hardest rules to break are your own. The pirates we highlight have dedicated themselves to creating good trouble.
Today on our podcast, we are chatting with Sheefra Blume. Sheefra is a life coach who helps people embody their deepest purpose for which they were born. She guides humans to unlocking their wild feminine through her work. Sheefra is also a survivalist and someone I would want on my side in the event of an apocalypse. Every time I talk with Sheefra, I learn something new, and we are very excited to talk with her today. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you both.
So I want to start off by asking you, you've spent a lot of time living in community, and you've built life living with people. What are some of the important lessons that you've learned about creating and communing in a pirate lifestyle?
That's an awesome question and place to start. Let's see. The first thing that immediately popped into my mind is the importance of communication and the importance of having shared values and an understanding of what those shared values are, even to the point of writing them down and then having that continued communication so that those shared values can continue to evolve and grow as you do as a community and as a group. That's the first thing that immediately comes to mind.
Yeah, that's awesome. That sounds to me like you've spent time building your pirate crew and writing out your pirate code together and living by a code.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that, because as I was just reflecting and answering Kristen's question, I was thinking, oh, that sounds a lot like a pirate code. And at the time, years ago, when I remember doing this with this specific community that I'm thinking of where I was for years, we didn't have that way of talking about it. Like we weren't thinking pirate code, but that's totally what that was. Yeah. And I remember, sitting around and writing it out and having all these conversations, and to the point where, like, even though I don't know where that original document is anymore, but I still remember some of the key features of it, and it still continues to be, it's like so embedded in my core values and what I bring, even when relating to other people and communities since then, right?
Mm-hmm. I'd love to know more about these communities that you built, or the community that you were living in.
Okay. Yeah. It's one in particular that is really where I spent the most time. It was about 6 years that we were co-creating that together. And it was out here in Oregon, just outside of Portland. And it was, let's see, where to start in describing it. You say you want to know more about it, I guess, in a general sense.
Yeah.
So the general sense was, just to give the framework or the picture for people to have in their mind, was, we had 10 acres, and it was 2 couples that were, you could say, holding down the fort as the core group. And then we had a flow of, guests, interns, apprentices, and volunteers. And those are 4 categories of guests that we would have. And each one was slightly different in terms of like how that interaction looked. But we would just have all kinds of people flowing through for different durations of time to participate in, really, I call it an experiment, that it was an experiment. And it was it was really an interesting experiment, because we were learning a lot about like Kristen said, I have some of these survival skills, and we were practicing a lot of homesteading skills and really simple living on the earth and being resourceful and being renewable and sustainable. So we grew most of our own food, including meat and vegetables. And we would have people coming through, and it was very pirate, I think, in that it was different than anything I've ever seen, although I know there's a lot of cool stuff out there that I'm still unfamiliar with. But we had this very collective and communal way of being where just about everything was shared. And one way that I've been describing it lately is that there was routine, but not rigidity. So like we would get up in the morning and we had a routine where we would gather in the common space and have tea and share our dreams. So the name of it was Nagdio, which it's from a book, The Kinabata Are Waiting for You. And Nagdio basically is a greeting, and it means to live in a way that sets you up to have strong dreams. And so your sleeping and waking dreams are very much intertwined. So the community was based around that, and that concept continues to be a really deep part of the work that I do today. But how that looked was setting your life up. Well, what sets you up for strong dreams, and why do you want strong dreams? Well, we'd wake up, we'd share our dreams, then we'd go on a run. There was a bark-chipped trail about a quarter mile around the property that we laid wheelbarrow at a time, and we would run together, but kind of each at your own pace. And if you didn't want to run, it was fine, but there was that accountability of like the whole group was going, so you kind of want to go. We would stretch, again, kind of do your own thing, but together. So there's guidance if you needed it, but do your own thing if you want. We'd have breakfast usually together. Someone would just make it. So it was different in that there wasn't like a schedule. There was no nagging you to like, hey, when's the last time you signed up to cook breakfast? It was just, I really like to cook. So I was cooking a lot. Whereas someone else really liked to weed whack the blackberries, which is really not interesting to me at all. Right. And so there was this concept of show up fully and offer, if you offer as much as you are truly able and not more, right? And also not less. It's true, like finding that true balance of really where is what I am able to give. And if we're each giving as much as we're able to give, and not less, but also not more, which is very important, right? And that's often forgotten. If you say as much as I can, oh my God, you think I have to give more than I can. That's different, and that was very much emphasized. And you take care of yourself. Then that's where you reach that state of Nagdio. So after our morning routine, you go off and do whatever work you had to do for the day, which a lot of our work was around tending the land and ourselves and each other. And it's that relationship with self, other, and the whole community of life on earth. So I'm just talking and throwing out what's coming to mind, but these are some of the base concepts that our community was focused around. And that is what we practiced, every day for the better part of the 6 years while I was there, practicing it with myself and with those that would come to stay with us. That's the gist of it. I'll stop there for a moment.
Yeah, I'm interested. You mentioned like apprentices. So what type of apprentices, what would they come to learn?
Yeah, that's a great question too. Oftentimes apprentices would find us through either the woofing website. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's like, what does the W stand for? It's volunteers on organic farms. I want to say it's willing workers, but it's not. It's something else. It's like volunteers on organic farms, and it's this website. And so oftentimes they would come and they would find us that way, or sometimes they would find us through. There's these traditional earth skills gatherings throughout the country that I've attended some, I've taught at some, and we would meet people at those gatherings in person as well. And sometimes they would come through that. And then I was teaching a lot of yoga at that time as well. So sometimes they would meet me through that. So through these different avenues, people would meet us, and then we would invite them to stay. And if they were strangers, meaning we hadn't already spent time with them for a week at a gathering or something like that, if they were just through the website, then, you know, we would vet people, which that boundary and that discernment in community, you know, Kristen's original question of like, what were some of the main takeaways? How to say no in a way that was empowering to people. Like we had to vet people before we even invited them. And then we would invite people for a 3-day stay. And often we would send them along after those 3 days. And sometimes we would invite them to continue to stay. And, you know, often they thought they wanted to stay past those 3 days, even if they didn't get that invitation. And so how to really turn people down and say no and have that strong boundary in a way that was so compassionate that there was healing in it for them, so that they could leave realizing, oh, I just got something and I'm actually more on my path as I walk away because of this 3-day experience. They could leave feeling empowered rather than rejected. That was a huge lesson and a huge part of what that looked like in inviting. So they would come to learn homesteading skills and earth skills, but I would say more than that, like those were the external things that we were teaching. And really the focus was the inner work, and I would say self-care and self-discovery, even more than, you know, those things are intertwined. It was self-discovery. So we had these tools through which we helped people to get grounded and to feel more capable. And those weren't really the end goal, though. The end goal was self-discovery. That, yeah.
And how has what you've learned from that time living in community and learning, setting those boundaries, how is that now transferred into your life going forward? So using your pirate code that you created, what did you keep? And how is it influencing you now?
Yeah, I feel like on so many levels that time period, the code that we wrote and just the life that we lived has infused itself into my cells and into, you know, the words I speak and the air that I breathe. And, you know, this goes to the story work that I do, and then which is like, did I freeze? I may have frozen for a second.
Yeah, I think you froze. So say it again.
Okay, so that time period, that code, and I'll give some specific examples, but I first just want to say that the code that we wrote and the experience that we lived for those years has infused itself into my blood and bones, you know, into the air that I breathe and the words that I speak. And the reason is because we were creating a different story to live in. And then we were practicing living in that story. So before I give you the examples of like this way and this way, I want to speak into this for a moment because it's so important. Because, you know, we came, each of us in our own story with our own background, and we came from this greater, you know, culture, Western culture that we're all living in, even though we all have our own experiences of it. And so there are storylines that we take for granted, especially about what it means to share or have a life of sharing or collaborate or, you know, versus competition, and just all this stuff that is just so deeply ingrained into how we, but because of past experiences, expect to have to guard ourselves or defend ourselves, or just what relating will be like, or what exchange has to be like. And so it's like we come in with expectations. And so we really made an effort to create a code for a life of collaboration and sharing and mutual support, where instead of it being we're a bunch of individuals and we're going to work together, but like we're just totally separate entities, we did our best to try on the story of, you know, what if we're a hand and we're each a finger on this hand and we're working together as this hand. That's the best way I can think to give that analogy right now. So, but to actually integrate that is really challenging when you're coming from, your whole life lived where that's not the norm. And so the reason, so the way that you shift is like the stories that we told ourselves. We were telling ourselves this new story about how we were, this unit, or how we were going to work together. And I would say, without addressing it, like if we were just to have a list of rules on the wall, and this is what I see where some communities end up falling short with this, is you'll see communities where there's like, oh, there's a list of rules on the wall, but that doesn't address it at this deeper level of like my beliefs. By shifting like who I am, like which character I am, and what does that character role play in this narrative of who we are as a group, like really addressing it in that narrative way. And when you do that, I think that change will stick, even if the circumstances change. Like I'm no longer living there, that it doesn't exist anymore, right? And that's okay, but the narrative has stuck. And even my friends who were there with me, like the narrative is still living in them in their own way. So specific ways that like that code manifests and that it still plays into my life today, for example, is like some of those habits for Nagdio, for that self-care. It's really ingrained in me, right? To wake up and remember my dreams and get some movement into my body right away. Even though now I live alone, those years of doing it in community with people day after day, it's a habit. And then I would say also, like in our actual code, if we're going to call it that, we had these 3 concentric rings that we drew out. And the first ring was yourself. And the second ring was the people that take care of you. And then the third ring was everybody else outside of that. And that might seem obvious, but it's really different than how most people who would come in, like as apprentices, would work in taking care of all of their friends and people, and then collapsing, really, is what we saw a pattern of a lot, like really giving, over giving, and then just burning out. And then just burning out, where prescribed was you take care, and then you take care of the people in your inner circle who are taking care of you. And then, like outside of that, there's your other acquaintances and friends and like the outer circle. Then once you're fed and the people who take care of you are fed, then you take care of those people. And this has also really stuck. And then the third thing that I'll also add is just the concept of Nagdio itself, how to live in a way that is conducive towards strong and enlightening dreams. And the valuing of dreams has evolved for me into this concept of lucid living, which is something I talk about a lot, which is basically, if you're lucid dreaming, then you are conducting the events that are happening in the dream in the moment as they're happening. And so if we're going to see waking life as a waking dream, which I really do see it that way, because the way we interpret an event is very subjective on our perspective, right? So I could talk about that, but I'll just sum it up like that right now. So then the question is, how do we become that lucid conductor of this waking life dream? So those are the 3 top ways that come to mind.
So that sounds a lot like first of all, triaging your energy and where you spend that, in terms of like prioritizing yourself and the people that take care of you before you give away your energy elsewhere. Is that accurate?
That's a cool way of putting it. And I've never thought of it that way before, or like used that term to think about it. So that feels accurate, and I'd have to consider that more.
What was I going to say? I had one more thing. Now I forgot. Perfect.
Okay.
It'll come to you.
It'll come to me. I'll ask you later.
Okay.
In terms of, so what are you doing now, and what social rebellion are you looking to start, or have you started with your work now? And tell us about what you're doing now.
That's a cool question. Well, right now, I do healing and coaching work. So I have one-on-one clients that I work with, and that's the main thing that I'm doing right now. I am also creating a deck that I'm really excited about. That's it's a card deck that will come with a workbook, and it's called the Spellcraft deck, for crafting spells and being that, you know, a second ago I was calling it the lucid dreamer of your waking life, or I like to say the architect of your reality. So I'm working on that project too that I'm really excited about. In terms of, what did you call it? Social rebellion.
Yeah.
Well, there's two things that come to mind, and one is, let me get my thoughts real quick because there's two that come to mind. Well, the main thing that comes to mind is, what does it look like to really show up in one's authenticity fully and unapologetically? And then for me, as a very feminine person, what does it look like to really show up, fully in my powerful femininity, right? And to me, this is a straight up social rebellion in a world that really, I feel like, rewards when people shut themselves down and shut down their inauthenticity. And I also feel like there's just so much reward and encouragement for, I would say, the healthy feminine is devalued. I do say and see that in our current culture, there are more masculine traits that are rewarded more, and at the same time, the healthy masculine is also shamed and devalued just as much as the powerful feminine is shamed and devalued. So I really love speaking into that push-pull, that polarity, and with myself and with the people that I work with, first of all, clearing away all of the chatter and cobwebs so that we can even figure out, well, who am I really? What even is my nature? And then now that I'm clear on what is my nature, whoa, how do I show up as that? Which in my case, it's to be that fully powerful feminine. But for some people, it's to be anywhere else on that scale. But the main point being, how do I show up, fully as that when there's so much pushback? Because that's going to be true at any place along that spectrum. And then the other thing that I was going to say is, well, I guess there's two other things, but one is just this idea of, again, it's those three rings, but it's slightly different. I suppose it's a fourth ring, is the rest of the community of life. So often we'll talk about self-care so that I can give more. I'll first take care of myself so that I can give more to the people who take care of me, and then the people outside of that. And then oftentimes we will miss this fourth circle that to me is very important, which is, and the rest of the community of life. So to me, the bigger purpose, besides I want to feel good, I want to, have a bigger impact, I want to have this awesome life, I want to, take care of others to do that too. And then there's this other thing, which is, hey, how do we actually look at the story that we are collectively living in And then we look at where that story is going. So, and then how do we change that? So that's the bigger social rebellion that I feel like I am co-leading with my other pirate rebels like you guys. I mean, is this, for me, the way that I see it and would articulate it is, I see that the current story we're living in, it's really one of competition. To sum it up, like that is a word that sums that up really well. Obviously, there's more to it, but it's individuation and separation and competition are some of the themes of the story that we're currently living in. And what's tricky about a story that you're living in is that it's ingrained into a culture's beliefs and worldviews, such that it becomes like the invisible walls to the cage that you're living in, right? So have you guys, I forget the name of the study, but are you familiar with that study where they put kittens in a room and they grow up with the vertical lines versus the horizontal lines?
No.
I feel like I'm going to mess up the name if I try to remember the name of the study, but there's a study where they put cats in the room and they grow up with horizontal lines on the walls, and then the other set grows up with vertical lines, and then something like they either switch them in the rooms or they put like bars or chairs or something with the lines that are opposite to the ones that they grew up in, and the behavior of the cats was such that they determined that the cats couldn't see the lines that were not the ones they grew up with. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Where you're like a blindness to what they had grown up to. They're unable to see it. Yeah,
like they're literally unable to see. If they grew up with vertical lines, they couldn't input the horizontal lines. And so I'll look up and remember the name of that so I could share it with you guys, because that has always stuck with me so deeply, that if we grow up so deeply ingrained in a story or a mythology or a perspective, like so much of what we just say is like, this is true, is actually belief and perspective. And so unearthing that and bringing that to light is a big part of what I am doing. And then, well, now that we can sort of and that is currently true, now what do we do about that? So then rewriting a new story of this story, I would say, is one of belonging, and even deeper than simply, self-care and self-love and cooperation and community, which are certainly all parts of that. It goes deeper to recognizing that, hey, we belong here. And as much as I love the quote, like, we're spiritual beings having an earthly experience, and we're earth beings having a spiritual and emotional and mental experience as well. And recognizing, like, we're earth creatures, we're earth beings. We belong here. We were made for this place. It was made for us. Like, we grew up with it together over millions of years. Like, but this is story. So that first story of competition is leading us to, of separation, is leading us to destruction and self-destruction and destruction of so many things. And, you have talk of the scientists saying, oh, we're in the 6th mass extinction, which is like, okay, alarm bells are going off for me. And then it's like, well, how do we get there? Because human beings lived on this planet for a really long time. And anyway, you can look back and you can see where the shift really happened in history. And you can see that it's really actually recently in history that we've gone on this like destructive bent. And it started when that story of belonging started to break into a story of separation. And so you say, okay, well, if we want to heal and turn, it's like, we don't just want to, if the river of the story is flowing towards, self-destruction and destruction of the planet, then we don't just want to put stakes in the river to like slow the flow. We actually want to divert the flow of the river. How do you divert the flow of the river? We do that with story and with belief and with what our role is in the story. And if the story can shift to, I am part of this place, I belong here, you know, our ancestors belonged here, and so do I, right? Then I believe that shift in story is what will divert the flow of the river.
That's really beautiful too. And Karan looked like she was going to say something.
Well, actually, I was going to say, Kristen and I recently had a conversation about belonging and tradition and being, you know, immigrants, colonizers, whatever you want to call us, as a entire, like, you know, most of North America, that we've talked about how we've really lost the roots and the traditions of where we come from, which we both like completely agree. We have very little tradition. That's not what we considered in our conversation to be colonizing traditions. And so how can we take, you know, nations of people without that roots or connections to their past and to where they come from, and create a feeling of connection and belonging and togetherness?
This is one of my favorite topics in the whole world.
Yay.
Great.
I'm so glad that it's going in that direction, because, yeah, this is one of my favorite things. So, you know, we all come from different lineages and different mixes of lineages, and it seems like none of the three of us are indigenous to the lands that we're currently living on, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And something that I feel very deeply is that all of us have ancestors who lived indigenously on this earth. And, you know, for me, being, well, in my lineage, I can trace it back several thousand years. And I feel very blessed, and I feel like I personally am in this unique position where, sure, a lot of what the ancient ones knew has been, I'm going to make up some words here, religified and dogmified, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like attempted to be put into this way of like, let's use this for control. And that's true for me. And I think that's true for a lot of different, you know, more earth-based animistic or pagan type traditions. But I do feel very blessed in that I can still connect to a lot of the ritual and incantation and tradition of my ancestors personally. And then I've been able to, or I've chosen to go deeper and study into more of like the layer deeper in the mysticism of, you know, there's what's presented on the kind of really simplistic, basic, literal level. And then there's like this acknowledgement that, well, before it was written down and solidified into words and then translated into, you know, English, which like what I'm talking about would have originally been written in Hebrew or Aramaic, but let's just go with ancient Hebrew. Ancient Hebrew, rather than letters, the shapes that we call letters were actually narratives. They were symbols, and the words, they weren't words, they were narratives, right? So it's just this whole other, and the reason is because you go back, as soon as you write something down, you solidify it, you lock it in, you know, you give it one meaning on one level, and then it's warped. But you go back, and before anything would have been written down, you go far enough back, and these were, you know, semi-nomadic, hunter-gatherer, shepherding people who would have had a very animistic view of the planet. And what I've learned, and I'm not like a trained anthropologist. So this is, you know, just what I've learned in being an adamant amateur anthropologist and reading a lot, is that the spirituality of Indigenous peoples from all over the earth, you wouldn't necessarily call their practices like religions, but you could say, oh, they're spiritual systems. And those spiritual systems, at least the ones that I've seen, so I'm going to say most, were based in animism and in recognizing that there is life force, or you could use the word spirit, or you could just use the word like energy or life force, that is animating and enlivening all of creation at every moment. And so that's what I've seen in the spirituality of all kinds of different Indigenous peoples. And when I go back in my lineage and I look at, well, where did these, you know, incantations and rituals and practices come from? And you go into the mysticism, and then it's like, it's right there. It's what I just said. It's like, and I even gave a speech to at Princeton University one time to like all these rabbis and doctors and scholars. And I was like, basically showed them how in their own books, it was showing that the truth was that, you know, this concept that we were referring to as, you know, God, was this infinite life force that is animating all creation at every moment. So anyway, that's really an animistic perspective. So you go back, and the point that I'm trying to make, though, is that when I look at, when I take out the newer kind of dogma or religion to what I've received from my lineage, you know, there are some very basic patterns. Like, I tend to patternize things and see the patterns in things. And there are some very basic like categories and patterns of what is being taught and passed down. And those things apply to all humans. So if you start to narrow in, then you can see like certain things are developed because of certain lands that they were developed on. Then that's true in my tradition, and I'm not living on that land anymore. But then if you pull back just a little bit, there's some basic categories of things that are applied to all humans, to any human. And then from what I have been able to learn about other Indigenous cultures, I'll see the categories of practices. Did I freeze? No.
Yeah, a little
Did I
bit.
freeze?
Yeah.
Where did I stop?
The systems. So you were saying something about the systems.
Yeah. So in my lineage, I'll see like certain patterns or categories of practices that if you widen out just a little bit, those things apply to all humans. And from what I've been able to learn from other teachers of other traditions, other Indigenous traditions, what I've seen so far is that though the details will be different, like the categories of practice, the categories of reverence will mirror each other from place to place and system to system. So what I learned from that is that like there are some things that are specific, and when they're culturally specific, it's usually because it's tying into the land where it developed, right? And if you pull back just a little bit, there's still some things that apply to any human. So like in my tradition, we have fire ritual, we have water ritual, we have full moon ritual. Like it's not necessarily given by that title, but when I pull back, I'm like, oh yeah, this practice is a fire ritual, this practice is a full moon ritual, this practice is a new moon ritual, this practice. So you have these categories that are just human. And so one thing that I am very, very passionate about and just like so grateful for is that I have this inheritance. And one of my very favorite things to do is to give it away. And one of my like skills, you could say, that I have, or just things that I love to do, is to like take what I've received from my lineage and then take out the universal bits and then apply it universally and just like give it away because I can, right? And then people get to relate to that, you know, it's been universalized. Like here's what a fire ritual is. Here's where it comes from, you know, in my lineage, and here's how it relates to all humans. You get to relate to how you want to relate to that, you know, fire ritual or water ritual, because there's a really good chance that your ancestors had their own version of that, right? And so that is how I see being able to connect back to, you know, ritual and tradition, and even one's own ancestors, is to learn from others who are willing to share, and then like take away the dogma or the details or like the cultural specific things and look at those patterns of reverence. What are the patterns of reverence? And then how does, you know, sitting with how does that apply to my heart? And then, you know, there's I have a beautiful ancestral healing practice that I created. Actually, yeah, I mean, it's, I think I think nothing's new under the sun, right? So it's like I created this practice based on a consolidation of all kinds of things I learned from different places and different teachers. But I created this ancestral healing ritual, which is really just an opportunity for us to meditate on those ancestors and like heal some of that disconnect in our own heart, right? And then you know, there's this third piece of also, I seem to be putting things in categories of 3 today. There's this third piece of, and you know, now we have these patterns of reverence. I can relate that to my own heart and to my own lineage, because these are, you know, innate human things. And then also, how can I also be here now where I am? Because I am not living on the land where those specific incantations were first whispered from the lips of my ancestors. They were living far away from where I am now. And other people were living here. And now I'm living here, you know, and so how can I integrate that, you know, with respect and reverence and gratitude? And so, you know, something that I'll do is whenever, like if I move to a new property, a new land, is to just like have that humility and reverence for, you know, and it's like all of our ancestors prayed. Gratitude is a human birthright, right? So, you know, having that and just arriving with that gratitude and reverence and humility to a new place. And then you can think of, okay, I'm here and I want to ask the ancestors of this land to welcome me and just say, hey, I'm doing the best I can. I come with good intention. I'm learning, you know, and there's so much more. Like to think that I'm just going to like do this life all on my lonesome as this human is like, oh, that's overwhelming. So I'm going to call on some help from something bigger than me. And I might have a name for it, or I might not really know how to have a name for it. It doesn't really matter. It's just a feeling. And I can go, and then, you know, what are the ancestors of a land? It could be the spirits of the people who lived there before. That's a possibility. But it could also be just the energy of the land, or, you know, the plant people and the animal people and the insect people and all the other kinds of people that are currently inhabiting this land. And then in this very literal sense, you know, the animals and plants and people who, you know, died and were decomposed and recomposed as the living, breathing physicality of this place right now. So even just that question of what is an ancestor. I know I'm going off on some tangents. I told you I
love it.
Keep
going.
But yeah, even just that question of like, well, what is an ancestor can be answered in a whole bunch of different ways, like I just started to outline. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure where I went from the original question, but
no, it makes a lot of sense. And one thing that I liked what you said was really finding the universal aspects of what, you know, your ancestors did, or what you've learned, or what is, you know, from your culture. Because one of the things that we talked about was like, how do we find a tradition and a sense of belonging without, you know, cultural appropriation of what isn't ours to take or to take on, and not knowing what our original cultural traditions were, right? How do we find that balance of finding something to believe in that isn't, yeah, cultural appropriation, and yet still not knowing where we came from. So I love that idea of the universality of what you're teaching.
Yeah, thank you. I think what is the thing to believe in? And to me, it's, you know, our humanness and our belonging to the earth, that we are creatures of the earth because we're human creatures, mm-hmm. right? And then the interconnectedness of ourselves as, you know, as people, and the interconnectedness of ourselves to this place, to this earth, and then literally to the place. And it's like, it's interesting because this whole conversation can be split into two categories. It can be viewed from like a very spiritual place, or it can be viewed from a very practical place. But to me, those are one and the same. They're like two sides of the coin. It's just shadows of each other. And so, you know, you're interconnected because all the energy is interconnected, and, you know, the butterfly effect and what you do affects me. But then you're also literally interconnected because we breathe the same recycled air, and, you know, we consume life. Like life requires life to live. Energy requires more energy. And so you consume pieces of, you know, plants or animals or water or air, and all those things came from somewhere. It's like, when you think of it very literally, where those calories traced back to and came from, made up of this place. And to me, that's a very spiritual concept, to think that, yeah, I'm not just a human. I'm also the air I breathe. I'm also the grass. Like, I literally, because, you know, if I ate something that ate the grass, it's like that connection. To me, that is meaningful, that story. Perhaps, you know, people will relate to that in their own way.
Well, when we're connected to the earth and the other creatures on the earth and the other humans on the earth, it gives us a sense of responsibility for taking care of each other and where we are. I feel like when we're disconnected from everything, then we lack that responsibility or that care to do what's right to, I mean, you know, which leads to the destruction of the planet, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Which is what we're talking about. I agree completely. And yeah, so just to summarize, like, for me, the to distill it down to that root thing that is a human thing to believe in. It's not like this mythology or that mythology, or this way of calling things or that way of calling things. It's to, like, root into the story that we are part of this place. Mm-hmm. We belong to it. We are it. It's not even we're part of it. We are it. And so to take, you know, and then, because if you feel disconnected, like, I belong from some faraway land and I don't really belong here, then there's a disconnect. And like you said, that inherent need to desire to take care of the place is lessened. But if we feel, oh, I belong here, I'm part of here, then there's an inherent softening and trust and caretaking that happens And then like the ritual, the point of the ritual is to get us there. So it's important. I would say what makes humans different from other creatures, other life, is that, you know, we're tribal, like a wolf is in a pack. You could say we're pack animals, but a pack is different than a tribe. We're actually tribal animals. And what makes a tribe different than a pack is that we're myth makers, and we're culture makers, and we're storytellers. And we're dreamers, those things. And so the ritual, it is important. And the point of the ritual, like I think of the water ritual, is to get me back to clarity and connection to earth and spirit. Mm-hmm. And so once you know, like I said before, those patterns of reverence, and then you know, remember that, oh, I'm part of this, then we can create a applicable and appropriate, you know, ritual that is informed by ancient wisdom and that applies to the current circumstance.
And like you've talked a lot about the story, like story that is being created individually and story that's being created communally. And we're all language story wizards here that love to create stories and talk about how our stories affect us and can either empower or disempower our life. So with that, tell us a little bit more as well about how with spellcrafting, you are helping people create those better stories.
Okay. Yeah, the spellcrafting is, it's really fun work. And I call it spellcrafting on the one hand because it's fun. And, you know, just to define a spell, it's a word or combination of words of great influence, which I know you both know. And so to be able to use our words and combinations of words, we are constantly, our words that are in our heads and in our speech are constantly influencing our actions, and therefore how we enact those stories, right? So how we experience our life. So you could say we're casting spells on ourselves and on the people we speak to all the time, right? So what if we become really conscious about recognizing how we're using language to influence, how we are crafting those spells, you know? And so it's so fascinating. And, you know, part of what I do too as like a ritualist and with the ancestral healing and as an energy worker is like I bring in that side of the magic too. And it's fascinating to see, like you go in to do the spellcrafting work, like let's just say like in a one-on-one session, we often don't even realize the story. Like we don't even realize what that, you could say a negative spell would be like a curse. We don't even realize the curses we're spitting on ourselves until you start to go into it. So it's interesting because like when I was talking about Nagdio, I said there's rhythm and routine, but not rigidity. And so spellcrafting is similar, where there's rhythm, there's routine, there's a protocol, and yet there's not rigidity, because it's like I am surprised every time at where the process wants to take us and at how we can dispel, you know, these negative stories or curses, and just things that people don't even realize are related. Like this thing I'm working on over here that's related to this other thing I'm working on over here that's related to this story. And I mean, I have some really epically cool examples, but that on the like private work level, that's how the spellcrafting works. You know, it's interesting too, because we think, oh, well, if I'm not speaking it out loud, maybe it doesn't matter if it's just in your head. But the thoughts that are in our head, first of all, that's what informs what we say out loud. Mm-hmm. And then second of all, there's this concept in the energy work of a thought form. And you know, when you're just doing your thing and you have, in this example, a negative thought that just thinks its way into your head, and you're like, I'm not even doing that. Like, so I think this is a common experience that people have. And what we call that, like, in the energy way of speaking of it, which you can take it as literal or as a metaphor. I speak in metaphors. So from the energy perspective, it's this thought form, which means it's this thought that we have given so much repetitive energy over and over and over, to the point where it's as if it's its own separate entity. It's not, but it's as if it were this own little entity, because we've given it so much gas that now it just sits there and it can just inform us, and it just pops in, and it's like it wants more food. It's like this hungry little, monster almost. And so the spellcrafting is, there's the linguistic approach, and then there's the energy approach of how do we dispel or disintegrate that energy entity, right? Like that thought form. And so in my work, again, whether you're doing it, they're not really separate, right? Like the language work and the energy work are one and the same. They inform each other and they work together. But, whichever way you're doing it, it's like first you want to clean and then you want to charge. So like you want to clean out your house and then you want to put new stuff in it. So you want to clean your energy field, then you want to energize. And same thing, it's like you want to break the old spell and then you want to create the new spell. So we think, how do we dispel or disintegrate those negative thought forms? And then how do we craft new ones? And then now that we've crafted new ones, how do we make those new thoughts and stories so strong that they start automatically thinking themselves into our head, so that they become the words that we speak, so that they become. And what's interesting is we think, oh, like, if I'm thinking good thoughts, I'll attract things to me. And that's I believe that's true. And it's so much more practical than that. Like there's reasons that that's true. And it's true because when you start thinking more of those thoughts, that's reflected, you're creating those energy thought forms. Now your energy is on board. Well, now you start speaking that. Well, the way you speak to someone, that you're going to get a very different response from them. Like if you say something in the affirmative, or if you say something kind of in a more complainy, shameful way, you're going to get a different response from someone. Okay, well, then your whole interaction with that person is going to change. And then the choices that they and you will make outside of, after that interaction is over is going to change, right? And so it's literally the reason we attract when we clean up our, language and our energy is because our thoughts and therefore our words and therefore our actions change. So did that answer your question? Mm-hmm. I get so excited on these topics that I just go for it.
I love it.
Well, anything about language and story work. I mean, obviously, Kristen and I get really excited about it too, right? We can talk about these things forever. And one of the things I love is when, I don't know about you, but when I'm working with a client, sometimes the connection with their old stories and what they're dealing with currently is so obvious, like it stands out. And I love it when the client finally sees that connection for themselves, because you just wanted to tell them from like minute 3, like, oh, there it is, I found it, that's your story, right? And it's really cool to see them discover it themselves and just be like, holy, I didn't realize that the issues I'm dealing with today are connected to this story from when I was 6 years old or whatever. And they can start putting the pieces together, and it is magical. It's magic.
Yeah. Well, and what's so cool about what you just said and the way you just described it is that, or I'd say what's different about this story work process is that you're guiding them to discover, when the spell was cast, if you will. And then it's different than some other kinds of coaching that I've seen, in that the point isn't to really like relive or talk about or chat about or journal about the experience. The point is more to discover, when was the spell cast? What is it? Where is it? And then how can we pull that out and then replace it with something new and more serving? And so it's just because of that, because the intention is so strong and the process is so powerful, and really, focused even, it's the rate of healing is just, it's phenomenal. It feels like magic, right? Which magic, what I'm going to paraphrase, but just for everyone else, the definition of magic is the apparent, like it apparently seems like there are supernatural forces at play, right? So the definition of magic isn't necessarily that supernatural forces are at play, but it's that apparently supernatural forces are at play, and that definitely is how I would describe this process.
Yeah, definitely. What I think the quote, and again, I'll probably butcher it, but one man's magic is another man's engineering or technology. And it really is just the technical side of language that we're dealing with that for us is technical, with, like you said, a process, and for others, it can appear to be, like you said, like magic.
I want to tie this back around, though. This is cool. I just had a connection of, we do, language work, spell work, however you want to refer to it. And we have a process for how to, break the curses and craft the spells. Well, for me, my history, there are incantations. I think I froze for a second, so I'll go back. But yeah, what's cool for me is I'll go into my tradition and my lineage, and I'll find these incantations, and and then I'll hear from other people from who have different ancestry than me, who have had that break and disconnect from that, or they're like, oh, well, we don't have those incantations, similar to what you were saying earlier. Like, I don't have those spells of my ancestors and the incantations of my ancestors. And what's cool, though, is because it's like, well, I have some of those, and again, you can see those patterns, and what we have is this recipe book. And so even without the verbatim language, or even not knowing the language, maybe it's a dead language that your ancestors spoke, right? But I'm like, I get chills speaking about this, because what we do have is a recipe for how to create, powerful combinations of words to create positive influence, which is a spell, which is, when I look into the Hebrew and I reread the incantations from that perspective, I'm like, that's what that was too. So just to like bring that around in that, well, how do we connect with that when we don't know the language that our ancestors spoke? Well, we may not know the language, but we do have formulas in this spell work that we're doing that is informed by ancient wisdom, that is then put into modernly applicable processes.
Yeah, it's cool how you tied that all together.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
All connected.
Yeah, it is all. Where can our listeners go to find out more about you and your work, spellcrafting?
That's a great question. The best place right now is going to be my Instagram. Mm-hmm. Simply because even as I have different, offers or landing pages, that is going to be a central hub that over time, like as people listening to a podcast later, that will still be a good central hub for people to check out. And that is just at my name. So it's at Sheefra Blume on Instagram. And you can find me there. You can connect with me there. Yeah, love connecting to our like-minded folks.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great community of that. And then how would you recommend our listeners go about starting their own pirate life, taking those small, bold actions, growing in community, whatever, what have you?
This is a great question. Listening to this podcast is a great start. And three is the theme.
It's the perfect number.
3 steps. There's 3 steps, and they're pretty short. I think the 3 steps are: address your language. It is vitally important. Mm-hmm. 2, address your energy. Address any, like have your version of your energy hygiene routine to recenter and reground yourself. That could look like energy work, but it could look like other things that are going to recenter and ground your energy. So address your energy and your language. And, the other thing that I have is the ancestral healing. But when you address your language and energy, especially when you're consciously bringing in that ancestral healing piece to those 2 will do that, and so that could even be like its own extra pillar, but let's just go with language, energy, and then get support. Like really, really, I mean that. I remember some 12 years ago, I felt so just lost and just desperately crying out for mentorship. And now I'm just surrounded by all the mentors that I wish I would have had then. Just like holding that little one, a version of me, and wow, what would it have been had I, had the access to like the right connections then, and had the willingness to choose to accept that, because it's both. It's not only having the knowing who those potential, mentors could be, but then having the willingness or worthiness or ability within myself to say, yes, I'm going to accept to go forth with this. If someone's like really looking to step into something new in their life, like find the people who are inspiring you, who are speaking your language, who are already doing it, and like work with them. That's what I've done. That's what I will always continue to do. And so those are the 3 things that I suggest.
Cool. So you mentioned communication earlier, and I have a really important question. First of all, actually, I have an important question for you. Do you know any good pirate jokes?
Oh, I was supposed to prep on this.
If you don't, we always have one prepared.
I can't think of one on the spot.
Cool. So this is going to go back to my very important question about communication. How do pirates communicate with each other?
How do they?
With an iPhone. But eye to eye is always best.
love it.
Got a great pirate.
Hi.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you for talking with us today. Again, learned so many new things, like every time I talk with you.
Thanks, ladies. This is so much fun.